70% of divorces are initiated by women in the US. 40% of women out-earn their spouse, yet 97% of alimony recipients are women. And if that's not heartbreaking enough, divorced men are 9 times more likely to die by suicide. So with these numbers, is marriage still worth pursuing for men? From financial consequences to custody battles where men will lose their children about 80% of the time. It's no secret that men face disproportionate challenges when it comes to divorce. That being said, here are 6 unnerving consequences of how marrying the wrong person can negatively impact your life forever. And this brings me to my first point. 43% of first marriages end in divorce, and that statistic only increases in second and third marriage attempts. After divorce, the average man's standard of living can decrease by up to 21%. Marital property, including homes, savings, and investments, is often divided up during a divorce, and this can lead to a reduction in net worth, especially if substantial assets were accumulated during the marriage. And divorce settlements often require splitting of retirement funds, such as 401ks or even pensions. This can significantly reduce retirement savings, and for men nearing retirement age, this can postpone those plans. Not to mention, the average cost of a divorce in the United States ranges from $10,000 to $15,000. And in ongoing legal battles in contentious cases regarding custody or child support can lead to stacking up of these legal expenses over time. And as a side note, attorneys can charge anywhere from $200 to $500 an hour. Now, one of the primary reasons that divorce seems to support women overall is due to alimony payments or spousal support, despite men not necessarily playing the financial roles that they historically used to. But in the modern world, legally, this expectation hasn't flipped, despite 40% of married women out-earning their spouse, which I will get to in a little bit. But first, we have to address why divorces even happen. There are several underlying causes of divorce that often go undiscussed, primarily because they're subtle, complex, or difficult to even address. These issues can quietly erode a relationship over time, leading to death by 1,000 paper cuts, gradually breaking down the relationship over time instead of having it come to an abrupt end. Here are some of the biggest, yet often overlooked factors that end up causing a divorce. The first one being emotional neglect or roommate syndrome. Many couples slip into a routine where they coexist but no longer connect emotionally or intimately, and this can ultimately lead to emotional distance and feelings of loneliness. A study published in the Journal of Sex and Marital Therapy found that 55% of participants cited growing apart as the reason for their divorce, while 53% reported a lack of communication. And without consistent effort to nurture intimacy, partners can feel disconnected, which will ultimately breed resentment and a sense of boredom or being unloved, and ultimately unappreciated. And this is often overlooked because people tend to believe that over a long enough time horizon in a relationship, the spark will just end, and they settle into a functional dynamic. But this is emotionally empty over time when neither part is actually focused on pouring into, continuing to deepen that relationship over time. And this leads me to the second reason: unresolved trauma and emotional baggage. The hardest thing about marriage that most people don't talk about is when you marry your partner, you don't just marry them as they are now. You marry their past, their trauma, their upbringing, their wounds, and every version of them they were before they met you. And having compassion and conviction can be a really hard line to ride, because they also marry all of that in you, too. Unresolved trauma, past relationship wounds, or personal insecurities can shape how your partner shows up in a relationship, and ultimately how they perceive and react in the dynamic of your marriage. Unaddressed emotional wounds can lead to defensive behaviors, conflict, trust issues, or the inability to be vulnerable. In that same study that I cited earlier, 29% of individuals cited personal problems as a significant factor in the divorce. And this indicates strongly that personal issues can strain a marriage overall. And this unresolved baggage can create cycles of mistrust, dishonesty, conflict, resentment, tension, and ultimately distance. And culturally, we can downplay or shame trauma or a history of wounds where people are really abrasive to seeking out help or even discussing the fact that these things still impact them. And on the other side of healing is growth. And that leads me to my next reason. You've got to aim to be compatible, and communicative in your individual personal growth. As individuals grow and evolve, they may develop new interests. This can lead to new values or even new ambitions. When one partner is committed to personal growth and the other one is not, well, you will see a breakdown in that dynamic. The National Center for Family and Marriage Research found that 55% of divorces cited growing apart as the reason that this happened, suggesting that divergent personal development can lead to the demise of your marriage. If one partner feels stagnant or unfulfilled due to the lack of their counterpart's desire to also grow in tandem with them, they may start to seek not only stimulation, but companionship elsewhere. Many people expect that they and their partner will naturally just grow together, not realizing that personal growth requires individual efforts consistently taken over time. And these things in tandem may need active alignment throughout the duration of the relationship. And with that assumption in place, well, that brings me to my next point. Silent expectations and mind-reading assumptions. Many people enter relationships with unspoken expectations about roles, their individual responsibilities, expectations, and how love should look. And when these expectations aren't met, partners can feel disappointed and resentful without ever openly expressing it. 67% of attorneys reported communication problems as the leading cause for divorce. Without clear communication, unspoken expectations will build up over time, and these will lead to unspoken frustrations, which can chip away at the foundation of your relationship. Over time, this can lead to chronic dissatisfaction, distance, and ultimately, resentment. Now, why is this so important? Well, most people will walk into a relationship assuming that the right person will just know what they want and how to do that. But this sets an unrealistic standard and expectation and pressure on a relationship and the other person. And this leads to the next reason why divorces happen. There's an imbalance in effort and contribution. When one partner feels like they're carrying more of the mental, emotional, or financial load, they may begin to feel undervalued or taken advantage of. The Journal of Marriage and Family published a study revealing that 21% of divorces were due to an inequitable division of labor. And this highlights the importance of balanced contributions in marriage. Any imbalance in contribution in a relationship can foster bitterness, especially if one partner feels overburdened with responsibilities or unsupported in their personal or professional goals. Now, the important part about this is couples tend to fall in this dynamic unconsciously, slowly over time without clear communication about how these roles impact the other person's feelings of stability, safety, and appreciation in the relationship. And this leads to another important point. There's a complete disregard for individual autonomy. Sometimes partners feel a lot of pressure to merge their identities or prioritize the relationship over their own personal goals. And the loss of yourself can absolutely lead to resentment over time. The National Institute of Health noted that 20% of divorces are initiated because one party felt a loss of identity. And this highlights the need to continue to create personal autonomy in your relationship. When somebody feels like they're losing their identity in a relationship, it can cause them to pull away. And this might lead them to seek independence outside of the relationship or even lead them to infidelity. Now, this is often overlooked because most people believe that a good relationship requires sacrifice. And to a certain extent, it absolutely does. But this can absolutely backfire if a partner feels trapped or just completely unfulfilled as they've lost themselves in the relationship. Now, a lot of couples will avoid these difficult conversations in order to keep the peace, but this leads up to a laundry list of unspoken grievances over time. The Journal of Divorce and Remarriage found that 20% of divorces were from unresolved conflict, and this suggests that unaddressed grievances can accumulate to a point of breakdown over time. Unresolved issues fester, and bottled up emotions create distance. And this will lead to separation of distance until it finally just falls apart. Now, confrontation and uncomfortable conversations are uncomfortable, so this justifies people avoiding them over time. However, what's more uncomfortable is divorce. And so a willingness to have a difficult conversation, air your grievances, and find resolution is a much better approach than avoiding it altogether. Now, with difficult conversations may come defensiveness or attacking somebody, and this leads to another reason why divorces happen, and that's because you've lost respect. Over time, partners can develop a loss of respect towards one another, either through subtle criticisms, dismissive behavior, or simply taking each other for granted. A study in the Journal of Family Psychology reported that 23% of divorces were due to a lack of respect or appreciation. Mutual respect is the foundation of a long-term relationship. When it erodes, partners feel devalued, and this leads to increased conflict and a fundamental breakdown. This is often overlooked because minor dismissals or disrespectful behavior can be justified and forgiven. But what you allow subtly will amplify over time to toxicity. Now, as a consequence to some of these issues, well, we have to talk about physical intimacy. Physical intimacy is one of the first aspects to suffer in a marriage, specifically when there are unresolved emotional issues. And over time, a lack of physical affection can lead to resentment between the two. Research published in the Archives of Sexual Behavior found that 15% of divorces were attributed to sexual dissatisfaction. So without a healthy level of physical connection, partners can feel unfulfilled in the relationship, and they tend to seek comfort elsewhere. Physical intimacy is a core way that people feel bonded and loved, so its absence can absolutely create a sense of disconnection. Now, this is often looked because when this starts to happen, people normalize that in the context of a marriage. And it can often be really uncomfortable to talk about because it can feel embarrassing. But the avoidance of this conversation, it will lead to more problems down the road. Now, it's important to note here that meeting the needs of your partner is your responsibility that you took on walking into this commitment long term. It's really important to be clear about the agreements that you have and how you can support and meet the needs of your partner. Now, a few other really important things that contribute to divorce over time: different financial values and spending habits, where, side note, finances tend to be the #1 reason for divorce. Another one being ignoring your mental health and your personal well-being, getting too comfortable to where you stop taking care of yourself. The most important thing here is that you have a willingness to address these issues head on. The goal is to create better understanding so that you guys know how to work together to resolve these issues and be proactive about handling them versus reactive in the aftermath. And this brings me to my next point about divorce. Now, as I alluded to earlier, women tend to receive the majority of alimony in the presence of a divorce. Now, the problem with alimony is that it's kind of outdated relevant to modern society. Historically, men were seen as the breadwinners and women were the homemakers, so having some alimony towards your spouse made sense. Under those conditions, she would have been at a financial disadvantage. So the math's there. But in the modern world, well, things have changed. As I stated earlier, 40% of married women earn more than their spouse. Interestingly, women earning more is a marker that increases the likelihood of divorce. Research from the University of Chicago found that these dynamics in a marriage are 50% more likely to end in a divorce compared to those where the husband is the primary breadwinner. Meaning that in a society where first marriages end in divorce at 43%, in the context of marriages where women out-earn their counterpart, the increase on top of that is 50% more. That's alarming. Now, when shining light on these statistics, some people may assume that I'm alluding that we should go back into historic times, and that's not the case at all. But if we want equality, like we say we want equality, we need to update some of the laws in which we're going about divorce. And this brings me nicely to my next point. If alimony seemed unfair, well then this one will be a doozy. A major point of contention when it comes to men and women in divorce is the conversation around custody. Despite the efforts to promote equality across the genders, there's still a prevalent assumption that women are much better caretakers than men when it comes to raising children. However, when we look at the evidence of outcomes for children based on this, that's not exactly what we find. Children from single mother households are more likely to experience lower academic achievement and higher dropout rates. Approximately 71% of high school dropouts come from fatherless homes. On top of this, a father's absence leads to further behavioral problems. Children from fatherless homes account for 85% of youths in prison and 90% of homeless and runaway children. And the absence of a father can lead to emotional challenges, including higher rates of depression and anxiety. Studies have shown that children in single-parent families, especially those without a father, are at a greater risk for psychological well-being issues. When it comes to physical health, children in single-mother households may face health disparities due to limited access to healthcare and resources. Conversely, children in single-father families have been found to enjoy better health outcomes than those in single-mother families. Now, you might think this just comes down to a man's ability to make money and have access to resources. but these outcomes are consistent even after controlling for economic resources. So while both single mothers and single fathers face challenges, children tend to have better outcomes in the presence of their father. And these findings underscore the importance of having a father present in a child's life. Now, some states, such as Florida, are a little bit more forward-thinking about this, and they tend to push for 50-50 time sharing for children. But there are many other states and judges who have their own biases around the female being the person who should have sole custody of a child. And while I don't want to paint a picture with a broad brush saying that that should never happen, my point is it should be highly considered if the father is able and willing to raise his own child. And speaking of custody battles, I'd be amiss if I didn't mention this point. This conversation gets deep if you start to ponder, do you really know your partner? Some would argue that you don't really know somebody until you live together. And I might argue that you really don't know the worst of somebody until you go through a divorce. And this is because I can't overlook the implications of abuse when it comes to custody battles and divorce. There are many instances of false allegations of abuse or domestic violence in divorce proceedings. And these allegations tend to be targeted towards men during divorce proceedings for custody. And this tactic puts innocent fathers at risk for losing their children and tarnishing their reputations. And this tends to happen without any concrete evidence. Studies have suggested that up to 35% of custody cases include false allegations. And it seems within our cultural landscape that men are guilty until proven innocent, and women the opposite. And these allegations and accusations can do lifelong damage to somebody's reputation and their livelihood. A national survey conducted by YouGov found that 8% of Americans report being falsely accused of domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, or other forms of abuse. And in 62% of these cases, the false accusers were reported to be female. And 27% of these cases, they were done in the context of a custody dispute. And as a side note, to the people who argue, well, the percentage isn't that high, it's not that many. In any other context, you and I would agree that one is more than enough. And this leads me to my next point, long-term outcomes. Men facing divorce often experience a range of long-term outcomes, and this can impact their financial, emotional, and social well-being. When it comes to mental health, they have an increased risk of both depression and anxiety. And as a consequence to this, they experience much more isolation and loneliness. Post-divorce or post-relationship, most men's social circles do change pretty drastically, and they are much likely to receive emotional support than women are. Interestingly enough, research indicates that divorced men have a higher mortality risk than married men, particularly related to higher substance abuse, alcohol use, smoking, and stress-related health issues. From the social and relationship aspect, we also have to look at the impact of their relationship if they have kids. Many fathers face difficulties in maintaining deep relationships with their children post-divorce, and this can lead to feelings of guilt, loneliness, regret, and resentment. And from a career perspective, men may experience decreased productivity at work due to the emotional toll and stress of divorce. And the economic strain that divorce can impose upon men can take time to overcome if they bounce back from it. Now, my intent behind this is not to persuade men not to get married, but rather to help you see that who you choose as a partner is the most important decision that you will ever make. And if you want to understand how to go about that, then click this video to find out if your partner is the one. And if not, I want to extend an invitation to, respectfully, fuck off. And if you're offended, I'm joking. I say it at the end of every video. Okay, bye. Oh my god, I can't get the desk out. I'm stuck. Oh, ka-chow.